Hello, everybody. Welcome to the PR Marketing Ask Me Anything. My name is Michael Brown. I'm the CEO of Vicarious PR and Vicarious Publishing, which is a specialized video game PR agency. And with me on my left, I will allow people to introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Turn it on. There you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kimberly M. Starks. I'm an accredited public relations practitioner. I have two businesses. The name of the first business is Blue Scorpion Reputation Management, which is a specialist communications firm. We specialize in reputation management and crisis communication. The second is Immense DC, which is an esports consultancy. Glad to be here.
Hi, hello. I'm Steven Johnson. I'm the founder of Launch Media Network. We're the creators of Game Skinny and Gamer Launch. We spend at least some of our time getting pitched by people like these two over here, as well as just searching out things to cover in games and news and information. So enjoy talking to you today.
Okay, so first question, anybody?
How would you recommend marketing to a niche audience?
So first, what I'd probably do is make sure that you've done your market research really carefully and your audience research. Figure out where that audience likes to operate on social media in particular, because not everybody's going to be on all platforms. So you're gonna have to look at, is that audience on Facebook primarily? Are they on Twitter primarily? Are they on Discord? That kind of thing. And then really spend time, and I mean a lot of time, crafting your message and your creatives. Like, you want to craft a message and any kind of outward-facing material, whether it be screenshots, whether it be banner advertisements, to actually appeal to that audience and know what they want, rather than doing something generic. Because if you do have a niche audience that you're targeting, then you're going to want to target them directly and understand what they're going to be looking for in any kind of outward-facing material. And once you've got that down, I think it's a case of really trying to figure out alternatives as well. So, try and go for like a really methodical approach to out-facing material. So do like maybe 3 or 4 different types of banners, do different types of advertising, test them out on Facebook, test them out on Twitter and stuff like that, and then see which perform best, and then double down on those. Anybody?
I'd like to add to that, in addition to conducting your A and B testing, even before that, I would suggest that you poll your audience. So you can make it fun. Ask yes or no questions across social media platforms, offer up opportunities for your audience to respond. When it comes to interacting with your audience, it's all about the feedback loop. You want to solicit interaction from your audience. That way, you know what they want to hear. And then comes the A/B testing, where you're testing the messages to determine which plays better with that specific audience, depending on the platform.
Next question.
And please raise your hand if you got a question. Just bring the mic to you.
Okay, so we're kind of working on a little organizational chart for our company, and we know all the game dev stuff really well, but when we get into this whole area of marketing, it's like, is there marketing, PR, we know there's marketing and PR and all these sort of little sub things, and then social media. Can you kind of explain how you should set that up? Where are those different? Where are they similar? Are they different? Does marketing cover it all? Do you have like a completely different department for PR, that kind of thing?
Sure.
And social media, yeah.
So technically PR comes under marketing. Marketing covers a lot of different types of things, but it tends to just be easier to explain to people who don't understand what marketing is, to separate them. For the most part, under marketing, particularly in the video games world, there's gotten to a point of understanding where PR is traditionally media relations, where you're outreaching to press, and influencer stuff, where you're outreaching to influencers. And then outside of that, marketing covers everything to do with paid advertising, social media advertising, all that kind of thing. So when figuring out what you want to do, it's best to kind of write everything down, because traditionally not all forms of marketing are going to be conducive to your game, right? Because there's just some forms of marketing that aren't going to work well with your audience. And so you want to really test out which forms of marketing work and which don't. So a perfect example of this is we did a game a while back, which is a mobile game, right? So in terms of what we want to focus on that is really traditional paid advertising on social media, and really try and get that user acquisition going. But we don't want to do media relations, or at least not double down on media relations, because there's not that many sites that cover mobile games. So yeah, that's a brief explanation of how they are different, but I mean that could take all day.
Well, I'd like to add on to what Michael just said. The biggest difference between marketing and PR is that PR, in the traditional sense, people think that it is about media relations, but it truly is so much more than about just reaching out to the media. When you're truly practicing PR, you are influencing a behavioral outcome. That means that you are getting your audience at the end of the day to do something, whether it be an advocate for your brand, whether you are getting them to make a purchase or something. You're getting them to do something, and communication is the means to get them to do something. So in answer to your question, and not being long-winded about it, it's planning and breaking out that plan depending on your audiences, who you're trying to reach, because even if you're a game development company, you have several audiences that you are trying to reach. So knowing who your audience is, where they live, be it on social media, do they watch television, those are important components in building your strategic communications plan, in knowing how to reach them in order to influence those behavioral outcomes.
How large are you? So, I mean, 5 people? I mean, I think the answer to this question is somewhat all based on size, right? At a certain size, to answer a little bit more of the people question than the process question, you're all marketing and PR. And in terms of everything you do is at that size is going to somehow contribute to a person here who interacts with you, or you're going to need to leverage all of your activity in the public space. And then someone has to be assigned at that size the whole marketing and PR responsibility. And accountability and responsibility are two different things. And so a person in the organization needs to be accountable for it. They need to be driving the rest of the people, talking about the metrics you're trying to hit, the reason and the purpose. But you're not yet big enough to just circle 10 people and say you're doing all that. There's going to be a lot of cross-functional activity. So what you're really doing is picking a person to track it all, to speak to it, to be the primary maybe decision maker in terms of how that feedback inside of the organization feeds into changes of the strategy. But you're all going to be involved until you get to 25, 30 people.
In terms of PR, the old days of sending out press releases, I assume, are gone. What's the approach now when if you can see, a list of writers, for example, or that are writing about your topic? Is it emailing them? What's the approach nowadays for PR to reach those media writers?
Oh, okay. So now content is king. We all are publishers. There's an opportunity for each one of us to be able to reach who we want to reach with the content that we create. So it's no longer where the traditional media outlets are the gatekeepers, and the only way that you can get information to your audiences is through them. You can post a blog, you can put up an infographic. If you want to reach out to the media, yes, press releases are still effective, but you can also pitch reporters independently as well. So there are a number of mechanisms in our toolbox that we can use in order to reach who we intend to reach.
I think you got to be in all these channels, and you got to think about repurposing content. So if it's something like you're talking about niche, right, and you've got something that appeals to that niche, then you should be figuring out how to email, Twitter, Facebook, that piece of content, because creating the piece of content with all the research, and I'm talking content as email headline, what you're saying about your company, what you're saying about what you're working on, that's content. And you've done some amount of research and you've learned a certain amount from it. The trick is to figure out how to leverage that 100 ways through 100 different channels, because the effort isn't clicking send on Twitter. The effort's actually getting the message that makes sense to the people you want to reach. And then you can either say, I know they're here, or you can keep throwing your line in the pond where you expect them to be. And so getting that content, getting it refined, and then just continuously sending it out through all the channels that are available.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, I think the idea that press releases are dead is a common misconception. I don't think they're dead. I think the quality bar has been risen, because if you think about how many games in particular are launching on a daily basis, right? So that's a lot of press releases that are getting sent somebody's way. So what's going to make yours stand out? So if yours is just a straightforward, bland announcement like 25 other than are, then you're never going to be able to stand out, right? So it's about what you put in there, how you put your website, how it's forward facing, what's content, what is the content on there, what's the quality of it, how well is it written, how well are your stories thought out? Because if you're just throwing another announcement out there, no one cares about that. But if you have some really interesting like data points that reflect something going on in the industry at large, and you have a really insightful perspective on that, that's an interesting story, right? And so it's less about the actual means of contacting journalists, because they're traditionally the same. It's just about what you actually put in those emails that's changing, and the barrier to entry is getting higher and higher. Next question.
So along those same lines, based on the content, as a small indie team, you really don't have a lot of time. You got to wear a lot of hats, and you maybe only have a couple hours a week for the PR marketing hat at some points. So what would you say is like the highest leverage content that an indie team should focus on first and foremost, if they're not going to be able to get to everything? What's the highest leverage stuff?
There's two answers to that question, in my opinion. So for your players, it's your game. And that's sort of obvious, except it has to be balanced against the other activities, which is you could have one really dedicated player, right? So in your space, getting someone who's reading an email saying this game's really cool to actually play it is difficult if you've got something of quality. And so I would focus on early customer acquisition in a perfect world, because there can be generated some social proof for the people that cover games that they see a community forming around it. No one is a perfect guess or a perfect observer of sort of social activity, right? Or just human response to something they're trying to cover. And so there are always external signals to, hey, there's something going on here in this community. Speaking again to like a niche kind of thing, you may think you really know gaming, but you don't know the habits and the likes and dislikes of every little genre. So seeing activity of that genre talking about your game informs a person who might cover it and informs what they should be looking at further. And so if you don't sort of get some initial sort of advocates, I think you're not sort of getting the flywheel spinning. So it's not just build it in isolation, get someone talking about it. Go get some press. It's like go get some community and then build on that community with press or coverage or just awareness. And then that's sort of like the simplest virtuous cycle, in a really macro way.
Yeah, no, I think community is a really good way to go, because it's almost required now to successfully launch a game. You're going to have an established fan base and community to leverage on launch day. Otherwise, you're just not going to get the traction that you need to be able to get all that organic traffic on launch day. I think if you're looking at areas to focus your time on, I often say to indies that $4,000 spent on a trailer is much better than $4,000 spent on PR, simply because a trailer will literally say 1,000 words. And so if you are going to invest time and money into something, then a visual asset like a trailer is really, really worthwhile, because we've often had many cases where the trailer alone has gotten a game coverage, just simply because how good it was. Whereas without that trailer, that game probably wouldn't have been covered. So visual assets are really, really important on that one. And then making sure that you're accessible is really key. So making sure that you've got a website, making sure that your domain name is registered to your email account, making sure that your press kit, you actually are able to download the images off your press kit. The amount of press kits that I see that people can't even download the images off them is incredible. So I think access and community and making sure your visuals are super good. If you only have a couple of options to pick from, then yeah, pick those.
And in addition to creating community, think about carving out a thought leadership platform for yourself. Even if you don't have a large community, you have something to offer in terms of your knowledge and your expertise. And going out and networking strategically and offering that is another way to build that community and also to carve yourself out as an expert in what it is that you have to offer.
Any other questions?
You addressed the marketing and PR stuff really well, but I was wondering how managing social media is that part of marketing, and how would a social media person work with the marketing people, or is that really a separate, is like managing your social media, talking to people through social media, advertising on social media, is that a connection or is it a disconnect?
Sure. So managing social media is outward-facing marketing, like everything is. It's all communications. There are many agencies that do handle social media. Like your social media person might do only community development, or they might do both community development and advertising, like social media advertising. It just depends on who that person is and what services they offer. But yeah, I mean, if you think about it this way, if you think about anything that you do that's outward-facing, so I would say, especially for small teams, anything that you do that's outside of having a team meeting is pretty much going to be covered under some form of marketing, because you're always communicating and you're always trying to attract people into the game. So whether it's on social media, whether it's on paid advertising, whether it's on PR, it's considered.
And again, it goes back to that feedback loop. So social media is very important for your brand because that's an opportunity for you to engage with your audience to find out what it is they like, what it is that they don't like, and you can adjust accordingly. So social media, yes, that's a big part of your overall communications plan.
So this isn't a challenge to your question, but is there a reason you think it wouldn't be a part of marketing? Yeah. So there's like a support element of it. Yeah. Yeah. So it gets. I mean, so that's an interesting sort of thing. So like a frontline support or tier one support, once you've got players and that kind of thing, and how is that different? It's going to come down to team size, but I think that it is a natural silo of sorts at some team size larger than a handful of people. In a very large organization, it probably would be, and there would probably be some way of assigning it, or really at a high volume. In my experience at smaller teams, there's just no sense in it. It's like cross training, two people. like communication bandwidth is the biggest like drag for any team. So anytime you can make it so that the person doesn't have to talk to someone else in order to get things done, you're winning. So, I mean, I would say that the person doing marketing in the early stages of any product development, whether it be a game, more traditional digital product, or anything delivered, has that as a channel. Support is actually one of your primary marketing and even PR processes, because in terms of sort of broad awareness or sort of building the brand concept, how you're perceived as a PR thing, support's critical. And there's only so much you can really provide through a social media channel. What you can provide is a human who sort of, speaks to the values of your company and what you're trying to do, and how they treat the customer and that sort of thing. And so they're sort of indistinguishable at that size. And even once you split them apart, you still, it isn't, well, you're support now, go treat our customers like crap. They're still marketing in a fashion, even though they may report to someone else. So. Yeah, so then you start to get that split out, and then you can find people calling them customer success people, or in a product sort of thing, or but in the end, there is still a line item on their responsibilities that says forward our brand, forward our customer awareness, and support customer and player acquisition. Even though the way they're doing it is through support or community or marketing PR.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. All right. One person you're going to say, you guys handle the marketing, and we got design folks over here. And then you kind of run into these things of like, all right, well, we want to put some outward facing information about the product we're developing. And then you run into little things like, do you let the developers actually talk to people? And this has come up for us because we're a little bit more seasoned in the industry and we're not used to and as prepared for all of the crazy social issues that have hit. So you can suddenly be doing something innocent. You're talking about something great in your game, and you have just offended a whole group of people you didn't even know you were offending, and wasn't, that kind of thing. There was a real recent example in the media with Blizzard that has caused a huge stir. And there's a person it's kind of a real weird area with was that person supposed to be representing the marketing team at Blizzard, but they let him talk as part of their, you know what I mean? So when you start stepping into these traps, that's when we tend to say, all right, look, we've got to be very careful about who is going to craft these statements and speak to the public. So that's where a lot of this fuzzy area kind of comes in.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what kind of issues there are, right? Because I mean, there's some crisis PR moments that happen that are just a set of circumstances that come together, and no one could have predicted that was going to go that way. Whereas there are other situations where I sit there and look and think, you put your foot in it and you deserve it, right? So, in terms of a barrier to, I mean, it has been my experience, particularly with developers, that the barrier to entry between developer and customer is always a good idea, just simply because, especially on smaller teams, and when developers have done a lot of the project, they get very emotionally invested in it, and when criticism comes their way, they tend to lash out in quite a nasty way, and they don't do themselves any favors, and oftentimes developers are not the greatest communicators in general anyway. So I do think that having someone like a community manager to be at least the first point of entry to any kind of issue is an ideal situation, just simply because then they can actually sort through the problem and see if it does need escalated to the development team or not, and they're able to put things politely, whereas oftentimes developers will knee-jerk and once it's out there on the internet, it's out there, right? You can't take it back. So I always think it is worth having that kind of protection, to say the least. But there's no solve all, right? Like if something happens in a situation where your game or your product offends someone or has a controversy around it, there is no like, band-aid that fits all. Like it's a case-by-case basis, and to solve it's going to be a case-by-case basis. And the process in which, the best thing to do is to really have a crisis PR plan in place to be able to know the process of, okay, bad things happened, this is the process that we have to go through. So we need to first stop talking to everybody on social media, have a meeting together, sit down, talk about the issue, and then figure out the best way forward. A lot of times that catches a lot of companies out, so they won't have a plan in place, and so they often emotionally panic to fix the issue, which often ends up making it worse. So if you are worried about that kind of thing, then putting a plan in place, and even just talking to a PR company about it, helps a lot.
And in the interim, and all of the points that Michael made are really, really good. In the interim of putting together that contingency plan, taking a look at the news of the day, an environmental scan, if you will, so that you and your team are aware of what's on the horizon so that you can plan for that day. And having a community manager to manage the conversation with the media or with social media, and having that one designated person, not the CEOs, of course, but a community manager is always good.
I think if you're concerned about that, you have to have a conversation internally, understand where you stand. And if you can't have that conversation internally, you're sure as hell not prepared to have it externally. And so that speaks to a crisis plan. You're doubly not prepared if you can't rationally talk about some of those things internally and figure out where the company stands. You're certainly not once something happens and you begin to react. Speaking less about the hot button issues and more about some sort of philosophy of support. Personally, we have always, and we're doing more internet products or software products, we've always taken our developers and putting them on support rotations. It builds empathy for the customer. It lets them understand what the effect of the things that they develop is. It also puts them in some feeling of control, in my opinion, where we task them with solving the things that came up during their support rotation. And so I think that it is a missed opportunity not to have everyone in your company interact with customers. You've got to determine what that level of interaction is that's appropriate, and mostly how quick back and forth that communication is versus like email support or something like that, that there's a bit more thought into each thing rather than like a Twitter or other channels that tend to be more chatty and problems happen.
My question actually piggybacks on his. It's kind of in three parts. Number one, what is the actual value of having a crisis response plan in terms of public relations? What should be the role of marketing within that plan? And what are some good guiding principles to incorporate into that crisis response plan?
Well, I can safely say that I've done quite a few crisis PR executions in my time. I think for me, the value of having a plan in place is massive, because it reduces the time. It can really help with damage control. I mean, because oftentimes when there's a crisis, say that there's a public crisis where something's happened and there's controversy surrounding your game or product, right? The time in between it takes them to report it and you to respond, the longer that increases, the less effective your response becomes. If you can nip something in the bud very quickly, then it's less of an issue, right? And it's also about a good crisis plan also helps you determine the threat level of the problem. Some problems don't need to be responded to, and because some problems, if you respond to them, it only adds fuel to the fire. So it helps you really assess the situation, and then it gives you a process in which then you can figure out a plan to execute to fix the problem. And oftentimes, it's something that actual execution is something that companies get very, very wrong all of the time, and a lot of PR professionals sit there and kind of face palm at the desk and go, "You did not listen to your PR rep that day." But I would say it's massively valuable. You know, there's so many companies that have you can see when they've had a plan in place and when they haven't. And you know, not mentioning company names, but you can see recent companies did not have a plan in place, whereas other companies, you know, when they respond almost instantaneously, you know that they have a really good system in place to be like, okay, let's sit down. How are we going to deal with this? What's the best way? And often the best way is also the honest way, unless you're a really shady company. The best way is just to, you know, if there is a mistake, admit the mistake, apologize, and fix it. You know, and I would say, yeah, if that answers your question, I would say it's definitely worth having if you don't have one.
Having a plan in place is almost like having insurance. You pay for it, and when you need it, you really need it. So it's really good to have it before an incident takes place, because once you're in crisis mode, that's it. But typically, unless it is a natural disaster, a crisis is not a crisis outright. It starts out as an issue that goes ignored. So that's the biggest thing. If you're noticing something, your audiences are noticing something, and you choose to ignore it, it snowballs into something bigger. So addressing it beforehand is optimal, because once you get to that crisis mode, you have only about 24 to 48 hours to contain it, and then the train has left the station, and you never want to get to that point. Then you're playing damage control. So being proactive rather than reactive is always the best way to go.
I think they've covered like sort of the PR, the customer-facing side really well. I think that you have to look at the value of it internally as well. And so, in other words, having a plan to react to that, if it's unlikely if something's truly a crisis externally, that there isn't an element of reaction to it internally in your company. And so, knowing either where you stand on certain issues that may cause those, or just having a plan to rationally work through it, keeps that from destabilizing. You know, so the question of value is, you know, what's your employee acquisition cost? What's the cost of dissatisfied employees, and all those related drag that's organizational, not even external, is worth thinking about.
If you're not especially producing content at a speed that's very easily, like you can put it out on social media and stuff, is it better to hold on to posts and make them at a slower pace, or do you think like kind of regularly still try to keep something going to like get people engaged?
I think the typical recommendation is consistency at whatever quality you can produce. So set your quality bar and then consistently produce the content rather than sort of do it willy-nilly. If you really are starting to get some people that are following it at all, then lack of consistency is going to be the death knell of them carrying.
Yeah, no, I think, first off, I'm still waiting for my marketing calendar from you two. So these two are students, by the way, who are making a game, and I'm trying to help them, but they're making it very difficult. So, no, I think, so definitely quality is an issue, right? So consistency is super key to anything that you do, but you don't want to give yourself too much work that you can't handle, right? So you want to kind of find a nice balance between quality. The quality needs to be of a certain standard that you can't have bad things going out on social media, right? Because there's no point. So you're better off doing like 2 posts a week rather than 5 posts a week if those 2 posts are really, really good. But you know, consistency is key, and I think it's a time management issue ultimately. It's about setting yourself time every week outside of development and just being honest with yourself and saying, I'm going to devote this 45 minutes to creating my social media content for the week and plan it out, right? Because a lot of developers fall into the trap of, I don't like doing social media, so I'll just put it off. And then they put it off, and then they put it off, and then 6 months have gone by. And social media is one of those things that you're not going to see massive dividends instantly. And that's what puts a lot of people off, is that they'll start posting and they'll get like one post like, 2 posts like, and they'll go, this is not worth it at all. Whereas it is a massive game of consistency and persistence, right? Doing this over long term will reap benefits later, right? You're not going to see, unless you know something goes viral and you do something really cool, you're not going to see, massive spikes. But 6 months of that, you'll go from 5 followers to maybe a couple hundred, right? And those couple hundred are going to matter when you go to launch.
There is an opportunity in between your regularly scheduled posts to have a behind the scenes to keep your audience updated as to what it is that you've got going on, or to host a Q&A live on Instagram. Things like that to keep your audience engaged while you're building the content that you plan to post are fun and spontaneous that your audience will enjoy.
I thought of something from the two of you talking. You're going to go through a period when you launch any sort of social media where you're screaming into the void. I mean, ultimately, quality is a funny topic when the ultimate arbiter of the quality can choose not to respond or not, or to respond or not, right? So you will go through some period of time. So you've got to set like your internal expectation or your internal knowledge of, is this a quality piece of content? And then be okay with its result. And then once you've built a following that's showing reaction, then the sort of variations between them are actually meaningful in terms of the external indicator of quality. Putting out your first post and you have 100 followers and you get no response means nothing. But doing it consistently at a quality level that's good will lead to the instance where you can actually tell the difference between the quality of 2 pieces of content.
So continuing from there, I'm working on like a short like narrative thing, and I feel like with a post every 2 times a week or whatever, I only have so much runway before I'm kind of like either spoiling the game for everyone, or I'm really just kind of running out of content to post. So what would be some of your suggestions for like maybe some creative content I can think up that's kind of outside of the scope of actual game screenshots or footage that I might not be able to share as frequently?
So my first question is, why is the content got to be about you? If you think about it, like, it doesn't always have to be about your thing, right? Like, the Joker came out, make a post about it. And be like, this was really interesting. Engage your community. It's not, social media is not an announcement board, right? It's not for you to go up, I have this week. Like, nobody cares, right? It is a place to go interact with other human beings.
Or they don't yet care.
Yeah.
And we're trying to get to this point where they.
But, interact with other human beings, right? If you went to see a really great movie, tell people about it and say, this was really interesting. What do you all guys think, right? And get people engaging. It doesn't always have to be about the game, right? It's, treat it like you would your personal page almost, within reason.
You don't have to wrestle every topic back to your game either.
Yeah, you don't have. Yeah, it's not always about. I always tell people to maintain that kind of 80-20 rule, right? So 80% of your content that you put on social media has to be entertaining and not necessarily about your game, right? 20% could be 20, like you self-promotion stuff, like, hey, we've created a new character in our game, whatever. But the majority of it needs to be just entertaining and engaging. And
It's sort of the leech ratio that a lot of things end up at, right? 80,
Right.
20.
So yeah, if you're really struggling for content, then you're not looking in the right places, and you're focusing too much on yourself rather than looking what's trending on the internet. As a perfect example, like, why not get in with that trending hashtag? Because it's right there, and it relates. It doesn't even have to relate to your game, but it's interesting, and you have something to say on it, and people want to hear about it. So go do it. Any other questions?
It's kind of a weird question, but like I guess as a if you're running like a social media page for maybe your studio or whatever, and say you're releasing different games, is it more optimal to have a separate social media page for a specific game, or is it more optimal to just have one general page for your company or whatever, and you're just releasing content about your games or what have you?
Yeah, this is a question I get asked a lot, and it's a question that a lot of developers wrestle with because, especially if you are producing multiple games, it's like, do I have a company one or do I have separate ones for the games, or do I do everything in one? I don't necessarily see the value in having separate accounts. That's not to say that sometimes it's not a good idea. I think it depends on the game, it depends on the content, but for me, I think it comes across better if you have a company account so that you can turn those followers into brand followers rather than just a single game follower. And that way that you can promote your other titles to them and they can still be on the same. Because if you look at it this way, like games used to do the whole, like, I have a company Facebook page and I also have a game Facebook page. But once that game launches and 3 years later he's dead, they have 15,000 followers that they're not doing anything with. So I'm a proponent of doing a company, because I think you should also be raising the profile of your company as well as your products. But people may disagree.
So there's a body of knowledge in community management related to this, and often you'll find it related to growing forums in like niche areas, as far as the most robust content. And the general sort of rule is that you keep things consolidated until the conversation around them begins to detract from each other. And this pattern appears in Slack, communities. It appears in forum communities. And I think it's the same thing on a Facebook page. If you have 10 games and you've gotten one for each of them, and you have 10 pages, and you got one person talking to themselves, and you will get crossover. You will get things going on if you focus on one place. And at a point, you'll realize that there's like some tension between those. And that's when you start talking about splitting them. Early bifurcation of almost any effort is bad. And so it's true in marketing. It's true in whether people are doing support and marketing, right? Like early split of things and tasks and responsibilities, or effort, is just a form of pre-optimization that's bad.
So my remaining question was whether it's social or traditional, how can we best keep a consistent brand voice when communicating?
If you figure that out, let me know. I think the best thing to do is planning, right? So you want to sit down and really decide on what you want your brand voice to be, and then actually stick with it. Because a lot of companies will sit down and they think they know what their brand voice they want it to be, and then they'll change their mind 6 months in, and then they'll change their mind another 6 months later, and then it's just all over the place by like 3 years in. So I would say stick to one, and stick to one that you actually like, and really double down on it. I mean, what you don't want, I would say avoid the extremes for the most part. Like a lot of companies try and be edgy or cool, quote unquote. And it never works out. I think if you can be more spontaneous and just natural, that is a better brand voice for longevity reasons. But yeah, no, I would say planning is key for that one.
And consistency. The messaging that you put out on social media would need to either mimic or be in similar vein when reaching out to traditional outlets, so that everything aligns and that it's not deviating too far from who you are as a brand.
I would start very broad, and that maybe like snarky versus friendly, right? Like in that, like both of those can play in almost any scenario, but they're gonna play better in certain cases. But I would say that's almost the opposite of like a customer persona. You're trying to build like a real image of a company and then how it would speak, and it should be a persona and not a stereotype. And so you start broad. And then over time, you'll see how the team naturally aligns to certain things. And as long as they're not detrimental, what you're trying to create is consistency, not the optimal way to talk. The consistency, again, becomes more important as far as what I've seen than hitting some magical combination of brand voice that just makes, dollars fall out of your customers.
Yeah, and I think you shouldn't be. I mean, be consistent, but don't be afraid to let your brand voice evolve as well. Like, that's not to say do a 180 and change it completely, but over time, as your company grows and as you get more exposure, your brand voice is going to change and it can evolve. Wendy's is a perfect example of what they did with theirs, where because they tried to be different for a long time, and then they figured out, oh, try to be funny on social media, that might work, and they did. So you don't have to be constrained by the brand voice, but make sure that it does align. Don't go from really nice and trying to project a family-friendly brand voice and then turn around and then it's all adult only, right? So you have the flexibility, but make sure that it makes sense. Any other questions?
I just wanted to ask, have you sort of, the three of you, I'm sure you've been dealing with marketing for a lot. What kind of PR incidents have you had to deal with personally, and how were you able to kind of deal with those situations when they came up? Something went wrong. How did you sort of put a plan into action yourselves?
Are you asking me to air my dirty laundry? Is that what's essentially happening? I mean, yeah, with marketing and PR especially, there's lots of instances where we've made mistakes and we've got things wrong and we've misjudged the message and how something sounds. And the key is just to make sure that we're tracking it and being able to pivot quickly is super key, right? Because you never know I know my audiences, I know my demographics, I know who I'm trying to target, but sometimes just, the way that I crafted a sentence did not stick. And so sometimes it's just a case of trying to change it up until it does work. I mean, there was one instance where I can't tell that story. Yeah, I mean, there's been a couple of instances where we had quite a large client and we accidentally, one of the biggest mistakes that we did was we accidentally misspelled their name on their own social media, so that was interesting. Cried about that one for a little bit. It was rough. But no, I mean, mistakes happen in marketing all the time. It's just a case of reacting and fixing it and being on point.
And of course, again, going back to the A/B testing to see what works with your audience. When it comes to PR marketing, like Michael said, we're human. Things happen. So worst case scenario, you make a mistake, you get back up the next day and you move forward. If no one responds to your message and it's just crickets, then okay, I need to work out another message, and you keep going.
In the covering gaming, we are sort of what you might consider a PR problem for a game company. For us as an opportunity. I would say that we've almost universally avoided PR issues because we don't publish things that we don't have some amount of conviction about. And for us, once you have conviction and sort of reasoned and rational presentation of information, then apathy is actually the enemy. And so negative and positive reactions are beneficial to us, so long as we're not being disingenuous. And I think that's our crisis plan, is to have a reasoned, rational opinion on things. How we've gone.
Anything else?
My question is, say I have a certain type of content I put out in a certain style, and I've been going on with that for a while, and my followers they know me as the person who creates this type of content or tone or whatever. How would I go about saying, maybe shifting into something else for a while? Maybe not completely, but just experimenting with it to sort of see how I like it and how I personally feel about it, to see if something larger I could pursue, and how to sort of deal with maybe people being not too happy that I'm not doing the same stuff I always do, and sort of maybe dealing with people complaining about that, or just maybe not hearing anything from it.
Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. I mean, if you really want to do it, and then read the reaction and decide whether it changes your decision. Otherwise flap in the breeze with every person that comes by and give you some feedback.
Yeah. I mean, I think you could make an assessment on what the reaction is. If you think it's super likely that there's going to be a negative feedback, like a negative reaction to it, then you could potentially preempt that with like just an honesty thing of like, hey, I'm going to try something new out for a little while, and just preempt that. But if you're completely unsure, that I would just do it and see what happens. Any other questions?
Hello. So, assuming, let's say a 12 or 16-month project cycle, what would be the optimal time to bring in an outside marketing team?
Do not wait till a month from launch. I would say depending on the size of the game, depending on what type of game it is, what genre, I would say anywhere between 6 to 12 months is probably where you want to be at. Bringing in for a really small indie game, then maybe you could get away with like 3 months before launch, but planning is really key to really good execution, so 6 months is probably better, especially to give time to really test the message out and to test everything out. But yeah, as long as you don't wait till like 1 month before launch, that's probably the best.
Any idea of like budget you would spend in that 6 months, or a percentage in the first 2?
Yeah, I mean, budget wise, it depends on the company. You would probably average about a 3K burn rate a month with a PR company, and that's not including like budget for advertising. So 3 times 6 is pretty much what you're going to be looking at to hire a decent firm. But you can also try and do that internally. It just depends on really which firm you want to go for. And what I would say is, if you are going to pick a PR company to go with, make sure that you know them very well and understand their brand, and they are actually interested in your game and not just taking a check. So a really good telltale way to do this is to send them the game and then have the meeting and then ask them a question about the game. And if they give you a really generic answer, it's because they didn't play it. Whereas if they're actually giving you feedback, whether it be positive or negative, then they did actually play it. And those are the people that you probably want to actually give your money to.
There may be some instances where you can get smaller slices of time from bigger outside firms than smaller. It's sort of counterintuitive, but it's actually easier for a bigger company to absorb smaller projects. A small company is going to try to get you into a $3,000 to $5,000 range because of basically staffing, just like legit, like just realities. A larger organization would be able to bring you in, do your pieces of your project in smaller budget slices, and that is not a sure thing. Don't go away from larger companies because you think they're going to charge you more.
Got time for one more question, and then that's it. Nope. All right. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming.